So the question, in some ways, if we go below this superficial level to a deeper level, the question is, why is it that the economists have not been able to persuade the public of the virtues of a free trade policy? After all, the argument for free trade is basically a very, very simple argument. Let me give you the argument which Adam Smith made 200 years ago. It's as persuasive now as it was then. And I quote, "In every country, it always is and must be in the interest of the great body of the people to buy whatever they want of those who sell it cheapest." The proposition is so very manifest that it seems ridiculous to take any pains to prove it. Nor could it ever have been called in question had not the interested sophistry of merchants and manufacturers confounded the common sense of mankind. Their interest is, in this respect, directly opposite to that of the great body of the people. That was the argument as he put it 200 years ago. And there is very little that needs to be added to it.
Very little that needs to be added to it, except accounting for externalities, environmental destruction, slavery, people just flat out ripping you off. You're assuming that the market is 100% rational. And the way he smugly says, well, it's the manufacturers and the merchants who fight against this. Well, yeah, to some degree, and it's also the worker who can't move to another country. Now, I personally, and I think this is objectively logical, don't believe in absolute protectionism nor absolute free trade. If it costs vastly less to produce something in another country, vastly less, more so than the amount of tariff that we impose as protectionism, then yeah, maybe it is completely logical to import. But the idea that if something costs $9.50 to produce in Mexico versus $10 in America, that it's in our best interest to buy it. I mean, obviously, you can do a reducto ad absurdum to prove this wrong. I mean, at some point, if it was a penny cheaper to get something that did not help increase the labor market here in America, or make jobs better here in America, you would realize that's bad. And he invokes Adam Smith and says Adam Smith made this argument. And in the next clip, Noam Chomsky completely debunks that by pointing out that people like Milton Friedman, much like Christians who reference the Bible, rarely actually know what Adam Smith said. And he does so amazingly well, and I'm not going to pretend I can do it as well. So here's Noam Chomsky destroying Milton Friedman's neoliberalist economic argument.
Adam Smith is very rarely read. He's worshipped, but not read. So, for example, everyone's heard of the phrase invisible hand, but almost no one knows how he used it. The term invisible hand actually does appear in his classic Wealth of Nations once. It appears in an argument against what's now called neoliberalism, what's now called neoclassical economics that we're supposed to worship. So we're supposed to worship Adam Smith and neoclassical economics, and they radically differ on the notion invisible hand. Adam Smith was concerned, as David Ricardo later was, that if there was free movement of capital and free import of goods, he was concerned about England. He said England will suffer because British capitalists will invest abroad and they'll import from abroad, and that'll harm the English economy. Ricardo had similar concerns. And Adam Smith then gave an argument. It was not a very good argument, but his argument was that English investors will prefer to invest in England because of what some called a home bias. They'll have a preference for investing close by, and therefore, as if by an invisible hand, England will be saved from the menace of free capital movement and of free imports. That's invisible hand. What's that got to do with the Cato Institute or the modern enthusiasm about free capital flow and having U.S. corporations invest in China so they can send stuff back here to sell cheap, exploiting Chinese workers? That's not Adam Smith. And it goes right across the board. I mean, everyone who went to college learn the first paragraph of Wealth of Nations, in which he talks about how wonderful division of labor is, you know, allows for all kind of efficiency and productivity and so on. Not very many people got to page, you know, whatever it is, page 400, in which he points out that division of labor is monstrous because it turns people into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a person can possibly be. It's a person who just becomes a machine. And that's a terrible attack on fundamental human rights. And therefore, he says, in any civilized society, the government is going to have to intervene to prevent division of labor. How many people get that far? You know? In fact, Smith does give arguments for markets, rather nuanced arguments. Or just take what they call trade. You know, the so-called conservatives are very excited that trade is increasing. So, for example, NAFTA is supposed to be a great triumph of conservatism. It increased trade between Mexico and the United States. Well, it's true that cross-border interactions between Mexico and the United States increased. But would Adam Smith or any classical liberal or traditional conservative have called that trade? I mean, suppose General Motors assembles parts in Indiana and sends them to Illinois for assembly and then to New York to sell. Is that trade? Well, suppose it happens to cross the Mexican border, but it's still internal to a huge command economy. Is that trade? Well, it turns out that if you look at the rough figures, which are all that we have, before NAFTA, the part of cross-border interactions between Mexico and the U.S. that was internal to a corporation was about 50%, and now it's about 2/3. That's no more trade than if the Kremlin produced things in Leningrad and sent them to Ukraine for assembly and to Poland to sell. That's just operations internal to command economies. We have just simply, you know, even to talk about trade or free trade or entrepreneurial values or consumer choice or democratic functioning and so on is putting us in a world of illusion and fantasy. That's why these terms are all demeaned, not just conservative.
Thank you for visiting my channel. Please subscribe, and if you're looking for life insurance, visit yourlifesolution.com/Hans to view instant comparisons of top carriers entirely online. yourlifesolution.com. Save up to 70% on life insurance with instant comparisons.